She builds shrines to men who never existed, while the real ones rot in her peripheral vision. Listen closely. Do you hear it? That's the sound of 1,000 conversations that never happened, words swallowed like bitter medicine, confessions that died somewhere between the throat and the tongue. There's an old Romanian folk tale about a man who fell in love with a witch. She told him that to win her heart, he must remain silent for 7 years. Not a word, not a whisper, not even in his dreams. The fool agreed. For 7 years he watched her dance with other men, listened to her laugh at their jokes, witnessed her fingers trace their faces. When the 7th year ended, he finally spoke. "I love you." She looked at him with eyes like winter and said, "Who are you?" This is what men don't understand about their own silence. It's not nobility. It's not strength. It's a kind of self-immolation, a burning at the stake of their own making. The modern man sits in the cathedral of his unspoken names, all the things he's never called himself, all the truths he's never admitted. He genuflects before the altar of female approval, not realizing he's worshipping a god that feeds on his diminishment. The air is thick with frankincense and failure, and the stained glass windows tell stories of men who gave everything and received shadows in return. Picture this. A 2024 study from the University of Melbourne found that men in relationships report feeling emotionally invisible at rates 340% higher than single men. They're not silent because they have nothing to say. They're silent because they've learned that their words are worth less than their utility. They've been trained, like circus animals, to perform rather than speak. But here's the grotesque beauty of it all. Women don't actually want silent men. They want men who choose their words like a sommelier chooses wine. Men who understand that silence and speech are both forms of power. What they get instead are mutes who've forgotten their own language. Phantoms who haunt their own relationships. I once knew a man who kept a journal of everything he wanted to say to his wife, but didn't. After his death, she found it. 300 pages of "I'm drowning," written in different ways. She wept, not because he was gone, but because she'd been living with a ghost for 20 years and never knew it. The female power that men fear isn't the power to destroy. It's the power to dismiss. To look through you as if you're made of glass, to treat your deepest revelations as dinner party anecdotes. This is why men build their cathedrals of silence. Not because they're weak, but because they've seen what happens to the ones who speak. They become punchlines, they become sensitive, they become less. You see, Kierkegaard wrote about the concept of the crowd, how individuals lose themselves in the collective. But he never wrote about this. How men lose themselves in the singular gaze of a woman who has learned to weaponize indifference. The crowd is nothing compared to the devastating precision of one person who knows exactly where you keep your dignity and how to make you surrender it willingly. The candle wax drips like tears of saints who've given up on miracles. The velvet curtains hang heavy with the weight of unsaid things. And somewhere, in a room that smells of cedar and regret, another man is learning the liturgy of silence, practicing the prayers of the unheard. Tell me something. When was the last time you said what you really meant? Not what you thought she wanted to hear. Not what would keep the peace, but the raw, bleeding truth of your experience. When did you last risk being seen as you are, instead of as you've learned to appear? The answer, I suspect, is written in the dust of abandoned confessionals, in languages only the silent understand. Every version of her you fell in love with is now a taxidermied memory, displayed behind glass. There's a Japanese word, tsukumogami, for objects that acquire a soul after existing for 100 years. But nobody talks about what happens to the souls of all the women she used to be, the ones you loved who no longer exist. I'll tell you a secret that shouldn't be spoken after midnight. Women are shapeshifters, not in the mythical sense, but in something far more terrifying. They evolve while you're still worshipping the ghost of who they were on your third date. And here you are, my dear fool, bringing flowers to a grave that hasn't been dug yet, mourning someone who's still breathing but no longer recognizable. She was wild once. Now she collects teacups. You loved the storm, but married the weather report. The museum of her former selves is a place every man knows but pretends doesn't exist. Walk through its halls. Here's the girl who used to steal traffic cones at 3 a.m., now lobbying for HOA regulations. There's the one who swore she'd never be like her mother, now speaking in her exact cadence. And in the restricted section, behind velvet ropes, the woman who said she'd love you even if you failed. Until you did. A 2025 Harvard study on relationship dynamics found something delicious in its darkness. Women change their fundamental personality traits 78% more frequently than men after entering committed relationships. But here's what the study didn't say. Men don't change because they're too busy maintaining shrines to outdated versions of their partners. You're dancing with a hologram, brother. Spinning around a ballroom with someone who vacated the premises 3 arguments ago. She's moved on to her next incarnation while you're still writing love letters to a previous operating system. I knew a man once. Let's call him Marcus. Because all tragic men should have Roman names, who kept a photo album of his wife. Not of their travels or celebrations, but of her facial expressions. Page after page of micro moments. The way she looked when she laughed at his jokes. Page 1 through 12. The slow transformation of her smile from genuine to performative. Pages 13 through 40. And finally, the last 20 pages. Empty, because she'd stopped making expressions he recognized. The Hindus speak of Maya, the illusion of reality. But they never warned us about this particular illusion. Believing that love means loving the same person forever, when in truth, you're serial dating different women who happen to inhabit the same body. And here's where it gets exquisitely painful. She resents you for it. She despises your nostalgia for her former self. Every time you mention how she used to be, you're telling her that you're in love with a corpse. She's evolved, adapted, survived. And you're standing there with flowers for a woman who committed psychological suicide years ago to become someone new. The museum never closes. Its fluorescent lights hum with the frequency of suppressed disappointments. The security guard is your own cowardice, making sure you never touch the exhibits, never shake them awake, never demand to know where the woman you loved has gone. But perhaps, and this is the sliver of broken glass that might be hope, perhaps the real horror isn't that she changes. Perhaps it's that you don't. You're the same model, same year, same factory settings, wondering why she needs an upgrade. You're a vintage record player in an age of streaming, playing the same song about who she used to be. Tell me this, and be honest for once in your God-forsaken life. Are you mourning who she was? Or are you mourning the fact that who she was made you feel like who you wanted to be? Because there's a difference, and that difference is the distance between grief and narcissism. The taxidermied memories watch you with glass eyes. Somewhere, she's becoming someone new again, and you're still the museum's only visitor, paying admission to stare at exhibits of your own delusion. You've been living on credit in a relationship where the interest rate is your soul. Shh, listen. That's not your heartbeat. That's the sound of the meter running. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment of vulnerability. It all has a price, and you've been paying in a currency you can't afford to lose, yourself. There's an ancient Sumerian tablet, 4,000 years old, that contains humanity's first written complaint. It's about bad copper. A man named Nani, writing to Ea Nasir, furious about being cheated in a business deal. 4 millennia later, and we're still keeping score, still calculating what we're owed, still furious about bad trades. Except now, the commodity is emotional labor, and the marketplace is your bedroom. Let me paint you a picture with colors that don't exist in daylight. You've become an accountant of affection. Every "I love you" is a deposit. Every fight is a withdrawal. Every time she turns away is a fee. You're balancing books that were cooked from the start, trying to make sense of an economy where you're always in deficit. Schopenhauer wrote that life is suffering, but the bastard never had to navigate the complex derivatives market of modern intimacy. He never had to calculate the exchange rate between vulnerability and rejection, between authenticity and abandonment. Here's what the 2024 Journal of Behavioral Economics discovered when they studied relationship dynamics. Men consistently overvalue their emotional contributions by 67% while undervaluing their partners by 45%, but here's the delicious twist. Women do the exact opposite. Everyone thinks they're the one being cheated. Everyone's sure they're giving more than they get. The house always wins, and the house is loneliness, dressed up as togetherness. I once watched a couple at a restaurant. Let's call it field research in the anthropology of despair. He paid for dinner. She thanked him. He held the door. She walked through. He complimented her dress. She smiled, and I saw it, clear as funeral bells. He was keeping count. Every gesture was a tick mark in some invisible ledger. She knew it too. Her smile was the kind you give to a debt collector, polite, distant, already planning her escape. The economics of emotional bankruptcy work like this. You start rich in hope. You spend lavishly on grand gestures. You invest in futures that will never mature. And slowly, transaction by transaction, you're depleted. But here's the thing about emotional bankruptcy. There's no court to declare it, no fresh start. You just keep operating at a loss, pretending you're solvent, wearing confidence like a suit you bought when you still had credit. The Wolf of Wall Street had nothing on the Wolf of Main Street relationships. At least his victims knew they were being devoured. But wait. Here's where it gets interesting. Here's where Nietzsche would lean forward in his chair. What if the entire concept of emotional economics is the cage? What if keeping score is what keeps you poor? What if, and breathe deep before you consider this, what if love isn't a transaction at all, and you've been playing Monopoly in a world that runs on poetry? There's a Sufi teaching about a man who counted his prayers, keeping track of each one, sure that God owed him paradise. When he died, he was shown a room full of ledgers, his entire life of spiritual accounting. This is your heaven, he was told. You wanted to keep score. Here are your books. Count for eternity. The velvet curtains in this particular circle of hell are woven from promissory notes. The candles are made from the wax of broken vows. And somewhere, in a bedroom that smells like disappointment and expensive perfume, another man is calculating whether tonight's rejection balances out against last week's acceptance. You want to know the real tragedy? She's not even trying to bankrupt you. She's just living her life, and you're over here running a credit check on every sigh. You've turned love into a zero-sum game in a universe that doesn't keep score. So, here's my question, delivered with all the tenderness of a bankruptcy notice. When did you decide that love was something to be earned rather than something to be experienced? When did you become the CFO of your own heart? And more importantly, what would happen if you just stopped counting? The meter's still running, by the way, but maybe it always was. Maybe that's not the sound of debt accumulating. Maybe it's just the sound of time passing, and you're the only one charging yourself for it. He planted seeds of devotion in soil that was already salted with someone else's name. Once upon a time, in a village where the church bells rang backwards, there lived a gardener who fell in love with winter itself. Every spring, he would plant roses in frozen ground. Every summer, he would water ice. The villagers called him mad. His beloved called him nothing at all. This is you. This is every man who's ever tried to cultivate love in a heart that's been paved over, covered in the concrete of old wounds and other men's ghosts. You're out there with your little watering can of affection, sprinkling droplets on asphalt, wondering why nothing blooms. Let me tell you what grows in the garden where nothing grows. Silence thick as kudzu, resentment hardy as thorns, and the peculiar flowering vine of male delusion that somehow, this time, your love will be enough to break through bedrock. She told you about him, didn't she? Probably on the third date, after the second glass of wine. The one who destroyed her ability to trust. The one whose name she speaks like a spell that still works. And you, brave fool, you thought you could be the antidote. You thought your love was some kind of miracle fertilizer that could make dead things live again. The graveyard of her heart has the best grass in town. Everything grows well in graves, except what you're trying to plant. Here's what they discovered at Oxford's Department of Experimental Psychology in 2020. Women who describe themselves as emotionally damaged attract partners at a rate 400% higher than those who don't. But here's the morbid punchline. The attraction isn't to them, it's to the challenge of fixing them. Men queue up to be gardeners in poisoned earth, each one sure he's got the magic touch. I'll tell you about the garden where nothing grows. It's beautiful in its barrenness. The soil is rich with the decomposition of past attempts. The failed roses of the last fool fertilize the ground for your inevitable failure. There's a strange honesty in sterility. At least death doesn't pretend to be life. But you're out there every morning with your hope and your hoe, turning over soil that screams with each thrust of the spade. You plant compliments where criticism has taken root. You sow patience in furrows carved by another man's cruelty. You water with your tears. Oh yes, don't pretend you don't cry in the shed where she can't see you. And you wait for spring in a place where it's always February. Kierkegaard wrote about the aesthetic, ethical, and religious stages of life, but he missed one, the horticultural stage, where men try to grow gardens in other people's wastelands, where they mistake their own emptiness for fertile ground and their desperation for green thumbs. The Japanese have a practice called nakanishi, the art of making bonsai from dead wood. They take something lifeless and shape it into the appearance of life. This is what you're doing with her affection. You're carefully wiring dead branches, misting them with hope, displaying them as if they were alive. But brother, even the masters know, dead wood is still dead, no matter how artfully you arrange it. Here's the secret that grows in the spaces between what's planted. She doesn't want you to fix her garden. She wants you to admire its desolation. She wants you to witness the magnificent destruction, to applaud the thoroughness with which she's been ravaged. Your attempts at cultivation are an insult to her carefully curated wasteland. And perhaps, here's where a weed of wisdom pushes through concrete, perhaps the real garden isn't in her heart at all. Perhaps the only soil you can till is your own. Perhaps the only thing that needs to grow is your ability to walk away from barren land. There's an old Celtic myth about a man who loved a fairy. She told him that to win her love, he must never look back at her garden. For years, he tended it, never turning around. One day, he looked back and saw the truth. There had never been a garden at all. Just him, alone, gesturing at empty air while she laughed from behind glass. So here's my question, whispered like wind through dead leaves. What if you stopped trying to plant anything? What if you simply stood up, brushed the dirt from your knees, and walked away from the garden where nothing grows? What if the greatest act of love you could perform is to stop performing at all? The earth beneath your fingernails isn't soil. It's the cremated remains of your self-respect. And somewhere, in a greenhouse of her own making, she's growing the only thing that thrives in her climate. The memory of the man who didn't try to change her weather. In the end, the only vow worth taking is the one you make to yourself. There is a place where the abandoned go to become whole. Not a physical place, though if it were, it would smell of leather and smoke, of coffee at 3 a.m. and the particular silence that comes after you've stopped checking your phone. It's a place where men go when they finally understand that the opposite of loneliness isn't companionship. It's sovereignty. Welcome to the monastery of one. The brothers here don't wear robes. They wear whatever the fuck they want. They don't chant in Latin. They speak in complete sentences for the first time in years, even if only to themselves. They don't take vows of poverty. They've already been impoverished by giving away pieces of themselves like party favors. They take only one vow: to stop genuflecting at the altar of feminine validation. Let me tell you about the day I found this place. It was a Tuesday. It's always a Tuesday when your life changes. I'd just finished my 437th conversation about where this is going, knowing full well it was going nowhere, because nowhere was the only destination she'd ever allowed. I walked into my apartment, and for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt expectant, like a canvas waiting for paint that wasn't mixed with someone else's opinions. Solitude is the most violent form of self-love. It strips you naked of your need to be needed. And in that nakedness, finally, you are clothed. The Stanford Loneliness Studies of 2024 found something remarkable. Men who spent 6 months in intentional solitude reported higher life satisfaction than those in relationships. But here's what the study didn't capture. The transformation isn't in the solitude itself. It's in the moment you stop seeing solitude as a waiting room and start seeing it as the destination. In the monastery of one, there are no mirrors that ask, would she like this? There are no clocks that count the hours since she last texted. There are no scales that weigh your worth in someone else's metrics. There is only you, faced with the terrifying and liberating reality that you might actually be enough. Nietzsche wrote, "The man who does not wish to belong to the mass must cease being comfortable with himself." But Fred missed the deeper truth. Comfort isn't the enemy. The enemy is seeking comfort in the arms of someone who sees you as furniture, useful, functional, replaceable when styles change. I met a man once who'd been married 4 times. After his 4th divorce, he bought a motorcycle and rode it to Alaska. Not to find himself. That's tourist shit. He went to lose himself, to lose the version of himself that needed to be married to feel real. When he came back, he opened a bookshop. No romance section. "I've lived enough fiction," he said. "The monastery of one has a library. Every book is written by men who chose themselves, not in some new age self-help way, but in the way a drowning man chooses air. Desperately. Finally. Absolutely. Here's what they don't tell you about female power. It only works on men who've abdicated their throne. A king in exile is still a king, but a king who gives away his crown is just another peasant with a fancy chair. You've been so busy trying to earn your place in someone else's kingdom that you forgot you have your own realm to rule. But in the monastery of one, you remember. You remember what your laughter sounds like when it's not trying to charm anyone. You remember what your thoughts sound like when they're not being edited for approval. You remember what your life feels like when it's not being lived as an audition for someone else's attention. She calls your solitude selfish, she's right. Selfish. Finally, thankfully, irrevocably focused on the self you abandoned at her doorstep like an unwanted child. The candles here burn with the fire of bridges you'll never rebuild. The incense is made from the ashes of love letters you'll never send. The bells ring the hours you'll never spend waiting for someone to choose you, because you've already chosen yourself. And here, in the ultimate paradox that would make Kierkegaard weep with recognition, the moment you stop needing her to complete you is the moment you become complete enough to actually love. Not from desperation, not from deficit, but from the overflow of a cup that you finally learn to fill yourself. So, here's my final question, carved into the stone above the monastery gate. What if the greatest act of rebellion against the fear of female power isn't to conquer it, but to simply walk away from the battlefield? What if the only war worth winning is the one where you stop fighting for someone else's approval and start fighting for your own peace? The monastery doors are always open. The only requirement for entry is the exhaustion that comes from performing for an audience that was never really watching. The only prayer is the silent acknowledgement that you were always enough, you just needed to be alone to hear it. Welcome home, brother. Welcome to the monastery of one.